The Morgan family thought they were getting the perfect Christmas. Cozy cabin in the snowy mountains, a giant Christmas tree, and 7 days of pure holiday magic. But on their first night, something felt wrong. The decorations moved when no one was watching. Strange scratches appeared on the walls. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., they heard the sound of bells jingling in the darkness. What started as their dream vacation became their worst nightmare. This is the true story of the Christmas that changed everything. A story they've never told anyone. Until now. The Morgan family had been planning this Christmas vacation for months. Sarah Morgan, a tired mother of 2, desperately needed a break from her busy city life. Her husband David worked long hours at his office job and rarely spent quality time with the family. Their 2 children, Emma, who was 12 years old, and little Tommy, who was 8, were excited beyond measure. They had never spent Christmas away from home before. Sarah found the cabin online in late October. It looked absolutely perfect in the pictures. The wooden cabin stood in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by tall pine trees that would surely be covered in snow by December. The listing described it as a magical winter wonderland experience and the perfect place for family bonding. The price was surprisingly cheap for a week-long stay during the holiday season. Sarah thought they were incredibly lucky to find such a deal. David was hesitant at first. He preferred spending Christmas at their regular home in the suburbs, where everything was familiar and comfortable. But Sarah convinced him that the children needed this adventure. They needed to create new memories together as a family. After some discussion, David finally agreed. He booked the cabin for December 22nd through December 29th, giving them a full week to celebrate Christmas in the mountains. The children were thrilled when their parents announced the surprise trip. Emma immediately started packing her bags, filling her suitcase with warm sweaters and her favorite books. Tommy couldn't stop talking about building snowmen and having snowball fights in the forest. He imagined the trip would be like living in a fairy tale, surrounded by winter magic and Christmas joy. As December approached, the excitement in the Morgan household grew stronger each day. Sarah bought special Christmas decorations to bring along. She packed strings of colorful lights, a small artificial tree, stockings with each family member's name embroidered on them, and boxes of ornaments. She wanted to make sure their temporary home felt just as festive as their real one. David took time off from work, which was rare for him. His boss wasn't happy about it, but David insisted. This Christmas was important. He could feel that his family was drifting apart. Everyone was always busy with school, work, and their own activities. They barely sat together for dinner anymore. This trip would fix everything. It had to. The night before their departure, the Morgan family gathered in their living room. They watched a Christmas movie together, drank hot chocolate, and talked about all the fun activities they would do at the cabin. None of them could have possibly imagined what was actually waiting for them in those dark, isolated woods. Their perfect Christmas dream was about to become something very different. Something they would never forget. The Morgan family left their home early on December 22nd, right after breakfast. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds that promised snow. David loaded their suitcases into the back of their SUV, while Sarah made sure they had enough snacks and drinks for the long journey ahead. The GPS showed that the cabin was about 4 hours away from their suburban neighborhood. Deep in the mountain region, where cell phone signals were weak, the first 2 hours of the drive were pleasant and filled with excitement. Tommy pressed his face against the window, watching the landscape change from busy highways to quiet country roads. Emma listened to music on her headphones, while occasionally looking up to admire the scenery. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, checking and rechecking the directions on her phone. She wanted to make absolutely sure they wouldn't get lost. As they drove further into the mountains, the roads became narrower and more winding. Tall trees lined both sides of the street, their branches reaching overhead like long, twisted fingers. The houses they passed became fewer and farther apart. Soon, they weren't seeing any houses at all, just endless forests stretching in every direction. David noticed that his cell phone signal had disappeared completely about 30 minutes ago. Sarah's phone showed the same thing. No bars, no internet connection, nothing. She tried not to worry. The cabin owner had mentioned that cell service was limited in the area. They had written directions as a backup, which Sarah now held tightly in her hands. The temperature outside was dropping quickly. Light snow began to fall, dusting the windshield with tiny white flakes. Tommy cheered with excitement, but Emma felt something strange in her stomach. An uncomfortable feeling she couldn't quite explain. The forest around them seemed to grow darker and thicker with each passing mile. After another hour of driving, they turned onto an unmarked dirt road. The GPS had stopped working completely now. Sarah read the written directions out loud while David drove carefully over the bumpy, uneven path. The SUV's tires crunched over fallen branches and piles of dead leaves. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see far ahead. Finally, after what felt like forever, they saw it. The cabin appeared through the trees like a shadow. It was larger than it looked in the pictures, standing 3 stories tall, with dark wooden walls and a steep pointed roof. The windows were all dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring at them. No smoke came from the chimney. No lights welcomed them. No. David parked the car in front of the cabin. For a moment, nobody moved. They all just sat there, staring at their home for the next 7 days. Something about it felt wrong, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. David turned off the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy and uncomfortable. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees and the soft patter of snowflakes hitting the car roof. Sarah forced a smile and said cheerfully that they should go inside and warm up. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet forest. They got out of the car and immediately felt the bitter cold bite at their faces. Tommy ran ahead excitedly toward the cabin's front porch, his boots leaving small footprints in the fresh snow. Emma walked slowly behind her parents, pulling her jacket tighter around her body. She kept looking back at the forest, feeling like something was watching them from between the trees. The front porch was covered in a thin layer of dust and dead leaves. An old wooden rocking chair sat in the corner, moving slightly in the wind, even though nobody had touched it. David pulled out the key that the cabin owner had mailed to them weeks ago. It was an old-fashioned brass key, heavy and cold in his hand. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing darkness inside. David felt along the wall for a light switch. After a few seconds of searching, he found it and flipped it on. Yellow light flooded the entrance hallway, but it was dim and flickering, like the bulbs were very old. The inside of the cabin smelled strange. It was a mixture of old wood, dust, and something else they couldn't identify. Something musty and unpleasant. Sarah wrinkled her nose but said nothing. She didn't want to complain and ruin the family's excitement. The main room was large, with high ceilings and exposed wooden beams. A big stone fireplace dominated one wall, its opening dark and empty like a gaping mouth. Old furniture filled the space, including a sagging couch, 2 worn armchairs, and a wooden coffee table covered in scratches. Everything looked like it hadn't been used in years. Tommy ran around exploring every corner, opening doors and peeking into rooms. He found the kitchen, which had outdated appliances and cabinets with peeling paint. Emma discovered a steep staircase leading to the 2nd floor. The steps were wooden and creaked loudly under her weight. David brought in their suitcases while Sarah started unpacking the Christmas decorations. She was determined to make this place feel like home. She hummed Christmas carols while hanging lights around the windows, trying to ignore the cold draft that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As the family settled in, none of them noticed the scratches on the walls behind the furniture. Long, deep scratches that looked like they were made by something with very sharp claws. And none of them saw the dark shadow that moved quickly past the upstairs window. By late afternoon, the Morgan family had unpacked most of their belongings and spread them throughout the cabin. Sarah managed to hang the Christmas lights around the main room, and their colorful glow made the space feel slightly more welcoming. David got a fire started in the large stone fireplace after struggling with damp wood he found stacked outside. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Tommy claimed the smallest bedroom on the second floor as his own. It had a single bed with an old metal frame and a window that overlooked the dark forest. He loved it immediately, saying it was like having his own secret hideout. Emma chose the room next to his, which was slightly larger with faded floral wallpaper and a closet with a door that would unstay closed properly. Sarah and David took the master bedroom on the third floor. It was the biggest room in the cabin, with a four-poster bed and another fireplace, though this one looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, and Sarah noticed frost forming on the inside of the window, despite the fire burning downstairs. While arranging her clothes in the dresser, Emma found something odd. Hidden in the back of the bottom drawer was an old photograph. It showed a family standing in front of this very cabin. A mother, father, and 3 children, all dressed in clothes from maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But something was wrong with the picture. Each person's face had been scratched out, leaving only rough tears in the paper where their features should have been. Emma felt her heart beat faster as she stared at the ruined photograph. She wanted to show her parents, but something stopped her. It was just an accident. Maybe the previous owners had thrown it away and forgotten about it. She slid the photograph back into the drawer and tried to forget about it. Downstairs, David was exploring the basement. He needed to check the water heater and make sure everything was working properly. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and the light bulb at the bottom barely worked at all. The space was filled with old boxes, broken furniture, and rusty tools hanging on the walls. In the corner of the basement, David noticed something strange. There were words carved into the wooden wall beam. He moved closer and used his phone's flashlight to read them. The message made his blood run cold. It said in rough, desperate letters, "Get out while you still can." Below it was a date from 15 years ago. David stood frozen, staring at the warning. His mind raced with questions. Who had written this? Why? What had happened here? David stood in the cold basement for several minutes, staring at the carved warning on the wooden beam. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the letters with his fingers. They were cut deep into the wood, made by someone who was clearly desperate and afraid. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of the message, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted proof that he wasn't imagining things. He thought about telling Sarah immediately. She deserved to know what he had found. But then he imagined her reaction. She would want to leave right away. She would panic and insist they pack up and drive back home, even in the dark and snow. All the money they had spent on this trip would be wasted. The children would be heartbroken. Their perfect Christmas would be ruined. David made a decision. He would keep this discovery to himself, at least for now. It was probably just a prank anyway. Maybe teenagers had broken into the cabin years ago and carved the message to scare future visitors. There had to be a logical explanation. He couldn't let some old scratches on wood destroy their family vacation. He climbed back upstairs and closed the basement door firmly behind him. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner with the groceries they had brought from home. She smiled when she saw him and asked if everything looked okay downstairs. David forced himself to smile back and lied smoothly. He said everything was fine. The water heater worked perfectly, and there was nothing to worry about. They ate dinner together at the old wooden dining table. Sarah had made spaghetti and meatballs, Tommy's favorite meal. The children talked excitedly about their plans for the next day. They wanted to build a snowman, explore the forest, and decorate the small Christmas tree Sarah had brought. David tried to join in their enthusiasm, but his mind kept returning to those carved words in the basement. After dinner, they watched a Christmas movie on Sarah's laptop, since the cabin had no television. The internet didn't work, but Sarah had downloaded several movies before they left home. Tommy fell asleep halfway through, curled up on the couch with a blanket. David carried him upstairs to his bedroom and tucked him in carefully. By 10 o'clock, everyone was exhausted from the long day of travel and unpacking. Emma went to her room and closed the door. Sarah and David climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The temperature seemed to drop with each step they took higher into the cabin. As the Morgan family settled into their beds for their first night in the cabin, the wind outside grew stronger. Snow fell heavily now, covering their car and erasing their footprints. The forest was completely silent except for one sound that nobody heard yet. Somewhere deep in the darkness, bells were jingling softly. Sarah woke up suddenly at exactly 3 in the morning. Her eyes snapped open and her heart was pounding hard in her chest. She didn't know what had woken her, but something felt terribly wrong. The room was freezing cold, despite the thick blankets piled on the bed. She could see her breath forming small white clouds in the air when she exhaled. Next to her, David was sound asleep, snoring softly. Sarah lay still for a moment, listening to the silence of the cabin. The wind had stopped blowing outside. Everything was completely quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural and heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath.
Oh.
Then she heard it, a faint jingling sound, like small bells ringing somewhere far away. At first, she thought she might be imagining it. But no, there it was again. Jingle, jingle, jingle. The sound was coming from downstairs, from somewhere on the 1st floor. Sarah's mind immediately went to Christmas thoughts. Maybe it was just decoration bells moving in a draft, but the wind had stopped. Nothing should be moving. She felt fear creeping up her spine like cold fingers. She wanted to wake David, but part of her felt foolish. What would she tell him? That she heard bells ringing? He would think she was being silly and paranoid. The jingling continued, steady and rhythmic. It sounded like someone or something was walking slowly through the main room, wearing bells that chimed with each step. Sarah gathered her courage and quietly slipped out of bed. Her bare feet touched the ice-cold wooden floor, and she gasped at how freezing it was. She grabbed her robe from a chair and wrapped it tightly around herself, opened the bedroom door as quietly as possible, and stepped into the hallway. The darkness was thick and complete. She couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of her. The jingling sound was louder now. It was definitely coming from downstairs. Sarah's hands shook as she felt along the wall, searching for the hallway light switch. She found it and flipped it on, but nothing happened. The light bulb must have burned out. She would have to navigate in the darkness. Sarah pulled out her phone from her robe pocket and turned on the flashlight feature. The small beam of light cut through the blackness, showing the top of the staircase that led down to the 2nd floor. The jingling stopped suddenly. Complete silence filled the cabin again. Sarah stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her ears. She pointed her phone's light down the staircase. The wooden steps disappeared into shadow below. Should she go down and investigate? Should she run back to bed and pretend she heard nothing? Sarah stood at the top of the staircase for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. Every logical part of her brain screamed to go back to the bedroom. Wake up David, and let him handle whatever was happening downstairs. But another part of her, the protective mother part, thought about her children sleeping on the 2nd floor. If there was an intruder in the house, she needed to know right now. She took a deep breath and began descending the stairs slowly. Each wooden step groaned under her weight, the creaking sounds impossibly loud in the silent cabin. She held her phone out in front of her, the flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the darkness. Her other hand gripped the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she reached the 2nd floor landing, Sarah paused and looked down the hallway where her children's rooms were located. Both bedroom doors were closed, and no light showed underneath them. Everything appeared normal. She felt slightly relieved, but couldn't shake the terrible feeling that something was very wrong. The jingling sound suddenly started again, and this time it was much closer. Sarah spun around, pointing her light toward the stairs that led down to the first floor. Her breath caught in her throat. There, on the staircase, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. A shadow stood halfway down the steps. But it wasn't a normal shadow. This shadow was impossibly dark. Darker than the surrounding darkness. Like a hole cut out of reality itself. It was shaped roughly like a person, tall and thin, with long arms that hung down past where its knees should be. The shadow didn't move, but Sarah could feel it watching her, even though it had no eyes. The jingling was coming from the shadow. Small bells seemed to hang all around its form, though Sarah couldn't see them clearly. They chimed softly with a sound that was almost cheerful, which made the situation even more terrifying. How could something so frightening make such a happy, innocent sound? Sarah wanted to scream, but no sound came from her throat. She stood paralyzed with fear, unable to move forward or backward. The shadow began to move then, gliding down the remaining stairs without its feet touching the steps. It moved smoothly like it was floating, the bells jingling with each movement. As it reached the bottom of the staircase, the shadow turned and drifted toward the main room, disappearing into the deeper darkness there. The jingling faded gradually, until Sarah couldn't hear it anymore. She was left standing alone on the second-floor landing, shaking uncontrollably, her phone nearly slipping from her sweaty hands. She didn't know what she had just seen, but she knew with absolute certainty that something evil was inside this cabin with them. Sarah didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. She ran back upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door behind her. Something the room hadn't had before, but she desperately wished it did. Instead, she pushed a heavy chair against the doorknob and sat on the bed with her back against the headboard, watching the door until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. When morning finally came, everything looked different. The weak sunlight made the cabin seem normal and safe again. Sarah felt exhausted and confused. Had she really seen a shadow creature on the stairs? Or had it been a nightmare, some kind of waking dream caused by stress and exhaustion? In the cold light of day, it seemed impossible that what she remembered could have been real. David woke up around 7:30, yawning and stretching. He noticed Sarah was already awake and dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed with dark circles under her eyes. Asked if she had slept well. Sarah hesitated for a long moment, trying to decide whether to tell him about what happened. How could she explain it? He would think she was losing her mind. She wasn't even sure herself what she had experienced. She simply said she hadn't slept well because the room was too cold. David agreed and promised to add more wood to the fireplace downstairs. Seemed completely relaxed and happy, excited about their first full day at the cabin. His cheerful mood made Sarah feel even more uncertain about sharing her frightening experience. They went downstairs together and found Tommy already awake in the main room, playing with small toy cars he had brought from home. The morning light streamed through the windows, making the Christmas lights Sarah had hung look dull and unnecessary. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. There was no sign of anything unusual or frightening. Emma came down a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She complained that she had strange dreams all night but couldn't remember the details. Sarah's heart jumped at this comment. But Emma quickly moved on to talking about breakfast and asking when they could go outside to play in the snow. David made pancakes in the small kitchen while the children set the table. Sarah sat at the dining table, drinking coffee and trying to convince herself that last night had been nothing but her imagination. People saw things when they were tired and stressed. It happened all the time. There was a logical explanation for everything. But deep in her heart, Sarah knew the truth. She had seen something real on those stairs. Something that didn't belong in the normal world. And she had a terrible feeling that whatever it was, it would come back again. The jingling bells had sounded almost like a warning, like something was announcing its presence in the cabin. Something that had been waiting here long before the Morgan family arrived. After breakfast, the children begged their parents to let them go outside and explore. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving everything covered in a thick white blanket that sparkled in the pale sunlight. David thought it was a great idea. Fresh air and exercise would be good for everyone. Sarah reluctantly agreed, though she felt uneasy about venturing away from the cabin. They all bundled up in their warmest coats, hats, and gloves. Tommy could barely contain his excitement as he rushed out the front door, immediately scooping up handfuls of snow and throwing them in the air. Emma followed more slowly, taking in the beauty of the forest around them. The tall pine trees were heavy with snow, their branches drooping under the weight. David suggested they take a walk along a small trail he had noticed behind the cabin. It looked like it wound through the forest and might lead to something interesting. Sarah stayed close to the children, constantly counting them in her head to make sure they were both nearby. The events of last night had left her feeling protective and anxious. The forest was eerily quiet as they walked. No birds sang in the trees. No small animals rustled in the underbrush. Just their footsteps crunching through the snow and their breathing visible in the cold air. Tommy ran ahead, following the trail with boundless energy, while Emma walked between her parents. After about 15 minutes of walking, they came upon something unexpected. In a small clearing off to the side of the trail stood an old, abandoned church. It was tiny, barely bigger than a one-room schoolhouse, made of gray stone that was crumbling in places. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were all broken, just empty black holes staring out at the forest. David was intrigued and wanted to explore it, but Sarah immediately said no. Something about the ruined church made her skin crawl. It looked wrong somehow, like it didn't belong there, hidden in the woods. Tommy ran up to one of the broken windows and tried to peek inside, but it was too dark to see anything. Emma noticed something strange. All around the church, carved into the trees, were symbols she didn't recognize. They looked like crosses, but twisted and upside down, cut deep into the bark years ago. Some of the carvings had words beneath them in a language Emma couldn't read. She pointed them out to her father. David studied the symbols with growing concern. He had seen markings like this before in a documentary about folklore and superstitions. These were protection symbols, the kind people carved when they believed something evil was nearby. Someone had tried to ward off something dangerous from this place. And clearly, they had failed because the church now sat abandoned and destroyed. Before David could explain this to his family, Tommy shouted from the other side of the church. He had found something in the snow, and his voice sounded scared. The family rushed around to the back of the ruined church where Tommy stood frozen, staring at something on the ground. What they found made everyone stop in their tracks. Behind the church was a small graveyard, hidden beneath the snow and overgrown with dead weeds and thorny bushes. About a dozen old gravestones jutted up from the white ground at odd angles, many of them cracked or fallen over completely. But that wasn't what had frightened Tommy in the fresh snow. Leading from the graveyard toward the church and then disappearing into the forest were footprints. They weren't normal footprints, though. These prints were unusually large and strangely shaped, almost like human feet, but longer and with claw marks at the end of each toe. The prints were spaced far apart, as if whatever made them had been taking giant leaping steps. David knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. The snow around each footprint was slightly melted, like whatever had walked here was warm, possibly even hot. He reached out to touch one of the prints, but pulled his hand back quickly. The snow felt unnaturally cold, colder than regular snow should be, almost burning his fingers with its icy temperature. Sarah grabbed both children and pulled them away from the graveyard. Her voice was shaky as she said they needed to go back to the cabin right now. David didn't argue. He stood up and started walking quickly back toward the trail, his family following close behind. None of them spoke as they hurried through the forest. Emma kept looking over her shoulder, convinced that something was following them through the trees. She thought she saw movement in her peripheral vision several times, dark shapes darting between the snow-covered pines. But whenever she turned her head to look directly, there was nothing there except shadows and branches. The walk back to the cabin felt much longer than the walk out had been. The forest seemed darker now, even though it was still morning. The silence pressed down on them like a heavy weight. Tommy held his mother's hand tightly, all his earlier excitement completely gone. Kept asking if they could leave and go home, but Sarah told him they would talk about it when they got back to the cabin. When they finally emerged from the trail and saw the cabin ahead, everyone felt a small sense of relief. At least the cabin was familiar, even if it wasn't completely safe. David unlocked the front door and they all hurried inside, stamping snow off their boots. As Sarah closed and locked the door behind them, she happened to glance out the window. There, at the edge of the tree line, she saw a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. It was too far away to see clearly, but she could make out its unnaturally long arms hanging down at its sides. Then it stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. Once inside the cabin, the Morgan family stood in awkward silence for several minutes. The children removed their wet coats and boots, while David added more wood to the fireplace that had nearly gone out. Sarah went to the kitchen and started making hot chocolate with trembling hands, needing something normal to do to calm her nerves. Tommy broke the silence first, said plainly that he wanted to go home. This place was scary, and he didn't like it anymore. Didn't care about building snowmen or having a special Christmas. He just wanted to be back in their regular house where everything was safe and familiar. Emma agreed immediately. She admitted that she had been feeling uncomfortable since they arrived yesterday. The cabin felt wrong to her, like they weren't welcome here. She also mentioned the scratched-out photograph she had found in her dresser, something she hadn't told anyone about until now. Her voice cracked as she described the ruined faces in the old picture. Sarah set down the mugs of hot chocolate and turned to face David. She finally told him everything. She described waking up at 3 in the morning and hearing the jingling bells. She explained how she had seen the dark shadow creature on the staircase, how it had glided down the steps without touching them, how terrified she had been. Her words came out in a rush as she spoke, and tears started running down her cheeks. David listened to everything his wife and children said. When they finished, he stood up and ran his hands through his hair, clearly stressed and conflicted. He wanted to be the strong father who could fix everything and make his family feel safe, but he also couldn't ignore what they were all experiencing. He thought about the warning carved in the basement that he had kept secret. Maybe he should have told Sarah immediately. Maybe they should have left yesterday, but leaving now felt impossible to David. They had spent so much money on this trip. They'd driven for hours through difficult roads to get here. The snow was falling again outside, heavier than before, and the roads would be dangerous. Plus, it was already December 23rd if they left now. They would barely make it home in time for Christmas, and the holiday would be ruined anyway. David tried to rationalize everything. The footprints in the snow could have been from a bear or some other large animal. The shadow Sarah saw could have been a dream or a trick of the darkness. Old cabins always had strange sounds and creepy feelings. It was all explainable if you thought about it logically. He told his family that they should stay at least one more night. If anything else strange happened, they would pack up first thing in the morning and drive home whether or no weather. Promised. Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in her husband's eyes. He had made up his mind. The rest of the day passed without any unusual incidents. David worked hard to keep everyone busy and distracted. He suggested they decorate the small Christmas tree Sarah had brought, and the children reluctantly agreed. They hung colorful ornaments on the branches and wrapped silver tinsel around it. Tommy placed a golden star on top, standing on a chair to reach high enough. Sarah tried to get into the holiday spirit for the sake of her children. She played Christmas music from her phone and started preparing ingredients for the special Christmas Eve dinner she had planned for tomorrow. The familiar activities helped calm her nerves slightly, though she couldn't completely shake the feeling of being watched. Several times she glanced toward the windows, half expecting to see that dark figure staring back at her. Emma spent most of the afternoon reading one of the books she had brought. She curled up on the old couch near the fireplace, trying to lose herself in a fantasy story about wizards and dragons, but she found it hard to concentrate. Her mind kept wandering back to the abandoned church and the strange footprints in the snow. She wondered what kind of creature could make tracks like that. David decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. He went through every room on all 3 floors, checking windows to make sure they were properly locked and looking for any signs of how an intruder might get inside. Everything seemed secure. The windows were all closed tight, and the doors had working locks. He found nothing that would explain the strange occurrences they had experienced. In Tommy's room, David noticed something odd. The boys' toy cars, which Tommy had left scattered on the floor this morning, were now arranged in a perfect circle on the bed. David called Tommy upstairs and asked if he had organized his toys this way. Tommy shook his head and looked confused. He said he hadn't touched his cars since breakfast. He had left them on the floor. David felt a chill run down his spine, but forced himself to stay calm. He told Tommy that maybe the toys had rolled around when someone walked across the floor. It was an old cabin and the floors weren't level. Tommy didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. David rearranged the toys back on the floor and left the room quickly. As evening approached, the sky outside grew dark much earlier than normal. Heavy gray clouds blocked out what little sunlight remained. Snow continued to fall steadily, piling up around the cabin and covering the windows with white drifts. The forest disappeared into the growing darkness, becoming nothing but black shapes against a slightly lighter sky. David checked his phone for what felt like the 100th time, hoping to see even one bar of signal. Nothing. They were completely cut off from the outside world. There's no way to call for help if something went wrong. That realization made him deeply uncomfortable, though he kept his worry hidden from his family. Sarah prepared a simple dinner of chicken soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. The family gathered around the dining table to eat, but the mood was tense and uncomfortable. Nobody talked much. The only sounds were spoons scraping against bowls and the crackling of the fire in the nearby fireplace. Even Tommy, who usually chattered nonstop during meals, ate in silence with his eyes fixed on his plate. Emma kept glancing toward the windows, which now showed only darkness and falling snow. She felt like something was out there in the forest, moving between the trees, getting closer to the cabin with each passing minute. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. David attempted to start a conversation several times. He talked about past Christmases, funny family memories, and plans for when they got back home, but his words fell flat. Nobody had the energy or desire to pretend everything was normal anymore. The fear that had been building since they arrived had grown too strong to ignore. After dinner, Sarah washed the dishes while David helped the children get ready for bed. It was only 7:30 in the evening, much earlier than their normal bedtime, but everyone was exhausted. Stress and fear had drained all their energy. Tommy didn't even complain about going to bed early. He just nodded and walked slowly up the stairs to his room. David tucked Tommy into bed and made sure the blankets were pulled up tight around him. The little boy looked so small and vulnerable lying there in the dim light. He asked his father if they were really going to leave tomorrow. David promised that yes, no matter what, they would pack up in the morning and drive home. Christmas at their own house would be just as special. Tommy seemed relieved and closed his eyes. Emma was already in her room when David knocked on her door. She called for him to come in. He found her sitting on her bed, still fully dressed, with her suitcase open on the floor. She had started packing her belongings. David sat down next to her and put his arm around her shoulders. He apologized for not listening to everyone earlier. He should have taken their concerns more seriously. Emma leaned against her father and said quietly that she was scared. David admitted that he was scared too. He pulled out his phone and showed her the picture he had taken in the basement the day before. Carved warning: "Get out while you still can." Emma stared at it with wide eyes. David explained that he had kept it secret because he didn't want to ruin the trip, but he realized now that was a mistake. They should have left immediately. Emma agreed, but said it was too late to leave tonight with the heavy snow and darkness. They would have to survive one more night in this terrible place. David hugged his daughter tight and promised that nothing would hurt her. He would protect his family no matter what. By 9 o'clock, the entire cabin was quiet. Tommy had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's stress and adventure. Emma lay in her bed with the covers pulled up to her chin, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and groan the old cabin made. Sarah and David went to their room on the third floor, but neither of them expected to sleep much. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands nervously. She kept thinking about the shadow creature she had seen on the stairs the night before. Would it come back tonight? David paced back and forth across the room, checking his phone repeatedly, even though he knew there was no signal. He felt trapped and helpless, unable to protect his family from whatever was haunting this place. Around 10:30, the temperature in the cabin began to drop noticeably. David had put plenty of wood on the fire before coming upstairs, but the cold seemed to seep through the walls anyway. Their breath became visible in the air. Frost started forming on the inside of the windows, creating strange patterns that looked almost like faces or twisted figures. Sarah wrapped herself in every blanket she could find, but still shivered uncontrollably. She suggested they go sleep in the main room by the fireplace where it would be warmer. David agreed. They grabbed their pillows and blankets and quietly made their way down the stairs, careful not to wake the children. The main room was indeed warmer than their bedroom, but something felt different about it. The Christmas lights Sarah had hung were flickering on and off randomly, even though they were just simple string lights with no special settings. The shadows in the corners seemed darker and thicker than normal shadows should be. David and Sarah made a makeshift bed on the couch. They lay down together, holding each other close. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. David tried to appear calm and strong, but inside he was terrified, kept his eyes open, scanning the dark room for any sign of movement. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2 o'clock. Nothing happened. Maybe they would make it through the night after all. Maybe whatever evil presence was in this cabin had decided to leave them alone tonight. David felt himself starting to relax slightly, his eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. Then, at exactly 3 in the morning, the jingling started again. It was louder this time, much louder than the night before. The sound of bells ringing filled the entire cabin, coming from everywhere at once. The Christmas lights on the tree suddenly blazed bright, then shattered all at once with a sound like gunshots. Glass sprayed across the floor. David and Sarah jumped up from the couch, their hearts racing with terror. The jingling continued, growing louder and louder, and then they heard something even worse. Footsteps on the stairs. Something was coming down from the upper floors. David grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and pointed it toward the staircase. The beam of light shook wildly because his hands were trembling so badly. Sarah stood behind him, gripping his arm so tightly her fingernails dug into his skin. They both stared in horror at what was descending the stairs toward them. It was the shadow creature Sarah had seen the night before, but now it was fully visible and even more terrifying. It looked like the dark silhouette of a man, but stretched and distorted in impossible ways. Its body was too tall and too thin, at least 8 feet high. Its arms reached down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers that were far too long. The worst part was its head, which tilted at an unnatural angle like its neck was broken. The creature moved down the stairs in a jerking, twitching motion, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Small silver bells hung from chains wrapped around its entire body, and they jingled with each movement. The sound was cheerful and festive, completely wrong for something so nightmarish. As it reached the bottom of the staircase, the creature stopped and turned its head toward David and Sarah, where its face should have been.
Ow.
There was nothing but darkness. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all.
Oh.
Just an empty void that seemed to absorb the light from David's flashlight. But somehow, they could feel it staring at them with hatred and hunger. Sarah started to scream, but David covered her mouth with his hand. He whispered urgently that they couldn't wake the children. If Tommy and Emma came downstairs now, he didn't know what this thing would do to them. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, understanding that they had to face this nightmare alone. The shadow creature took a step toward them, then another. The bells jingled merrily with each movement. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at them with a finger that looked more like a knife blade. The temperature in the room dropped even further. Ice began forming on the furniture and walls. David did the only thing he could think of. He threw the flashlight directly at the creature as hard as he could. The flashlight passed right through the shadow, like it was made of smoke, hitting the wall behind it and falling to the floor with a crash. The creature didn't react at all. It just kept moving forward, slowly and deliberately. Sarah and David backed away until they hit the wall behind them. There was nowhere left to go. The creature was now less than 10 feet away from them. It opened its arms wide as if preparing to embrace them.
Ow.
More bells appeared out of nowhere, materializing in the air around the creature and filling the room with their awful, jingling sound. Then, from upstairs, they heard Tommy scream. Tommy's scream shattered the frozen moment. Without thinking, Sarah broke away from David and ran toward the stairs. Every parent instinct in her body overrode her fear. Her son needed her. Nothing else mattered. David followed immediately behind her, leaving the shadow creature standing in the middle of the main room. They raced up the stairs 2 at a time, their feet pounding on the wooden steps. The jingling bells followed them, echoing through the cabin. Sarah reached Tommy's bedroom first and threw open the door. What she saw inside made her gasp in horror. Tommy was sitting up in his bed, pressed against the headboard with his blanket clutched in his small fists. His face was pale white with terror, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He was staring at the corner of his room near the closet. Following his gaze, Sarah saw 3 more shadow figures standing there, smaller than the one downstairs but just as frightening. They were child-sized shadows with the same elongated arms and tilted heads. Bells hung from their forms, jingling softly. David pushed past Sarah and scooped Tommy up in his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's shoulder and sobbed. Emma appeared in the doorway of her own room, awakened by the commotion. She took one look at the shadow creatures in Tommy's room and screamed. More shadows were emerging now. They seemed to seep out of the walls themselves like dark liquid. They appeared in the hallway and Emma's room, everywhere at once. The entire second floor was filling with these nightmare figures. Some were tall, some were short, some crawled on the ceiling like spiders. All of them had bells that created a deafening chorus of jingling. David made a split-second decision. He shouted for everyone to get to the car. They would drive away right now, in the middle of the night, through the snow and darkness. Anything was better than staying in this cursed cabin one more second. Sarah grabbed Emma's hand and they all rushed back down the stairs together. But when they reached the main room, their hearts sank. The front door was blocked by shadow creatures standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid wall of darkness. More shadows filled the room behind them, cutting off any escape route. The Morgan family was surrounded, trapped. David set Tommy down and pushed his children behind him. He and Sarah stood in front of their kids, forming a protective barrier with their own bodies. If these creatures wanted to hurt the children, they would have to go through the parents first. The largest shadow creature, the one with the broken neck, moved forward from the group. It reached out one long arm toward them. Its finger pointed directly at Sarah, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like wind whistling through a graveyard. It said 3 words that made no sense but filled them all with dread. You were chosen. The shadow creature's words hung in the air like poison. You were chosen. Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand what that meant. Chosen for what? Why them? What did these creatures want? The shadow raised its other arm and pointed toward the basement door. The door swung open on its own with a loud creak, revealing the dark stairway leading down. The creature's message was clear. It wanted them to go into the basement. David shook his head firmly and said no. He wouldn't take his family down there. Whatever was waiting in that basement, they would face it here. but the shadow creatures began to move closer, tightening the circle around the family. Their bells jingled louder and louder, creating a sound so overwhelming it hurt their ears. Tommy covered his ears with his hands and cried. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, wishing this was all just a terrible nightmare she could wake up from. Sarah made a decision. She stepped forward and spoke directly to the creature, her voice shaking but determined. She said they would go to the basement, but only if the creatures promised not to hurt her children. Whatever these things wanted, she would give it to them. Just let Tommy and Emma go free. The shadow creature tilted its broken head as if considering her offer. Then it moved aside, creating a path to the basement door. The other shadows pulled back slightly too. David grabbed Sarah's arm and whispered desperately that they should stay together. But Sarah kissed his cheek and told him to protect the children. She would handle this. Before David could stop her, Sarah walked toward the basement door. David couldn't let his wife face this alone, turned to Emma and spoke quickly and firmly. He told her to take Tommy and go hide in the bathroom upstairs. Lock the door and don't come out no matter what they heard. Emma's face was wet with tears, but she nodded bravely. She took Tommy's hand and they ran up the stairs, weaving between shadow creatures that made no move to stop them. David caught up to Sarah at the basement door. They looked at each other for a long moment, both knowing they might not survive whatever was about to happen. But they were parents. They would die protecting their children if necessary. Together, they descended the narrow basement stairs. The basement was even colder than the rest of the cabin. Their breath came out in thick white clouds. A single light bulb buzzed and flickered, barely providing any illumination. The shadow creatures followed them down, filling the basement with their dark forms and constant jingling. They formed a circle around David and Sarah, trapping them in the center of the concrete floor. Then the largest creature pointed at the wall where David had found the carved warning. The wood began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Images started appearing on the wall like a movie playing on a screen. David and Sarah watched in horror as they finally learned the truth about this cabin. The glowing images on the wall showed scenes from the past, like looking through a window into history.
Ow.
David and Sarah watched as the story of the cabin unfolded before their eyes. It began decades ago, perhaps 50 or 60 years in the past. They saw a family moving into the cabin just like the Morgans had done. A mother, father, and 3 children, smiling and excited about their Christmas vacation. But this family had been lured here on purpose. The cabin's previous owner, an old woman who practiced dark magic, had advertised it cheaply to attract families during Christmas time. She believed that Christmas was the most powerful time of year for certain rituals. The joy and innocence of families celebrating the holiday created energy she could harvest for her evil purposes. The images showed the old woman performing a terrible ceremony in this very basement. She had trapped that first family here and sacrificed them on Christmas Eve, using their lives to open a doorway between the living world and the realm of shadows. The shadow creatures they had been seeing were not ghosts or demons. They were something worse. They were the tortured souls of that family, twisted and corrupted by the dark ritual, forced to serve the cabin forever. Well, but the old woman's plan had backfired. The magic became too powerful and consumed her as well. The images showed her screaming as shadows wrapped around her body, pulling her into the darkness.
Ow.
She became the largest shadow creature, the one with the broken neck,
Ouch.
the leader of the trapped souls. Since then, the cabin had stood empty most of the time, waiting. Every few years, another family would be drawn here by the mysteriously cheap price and perfect location. The shadow creatures would appear to them, feeding on their fear and terror. Some families escaped and never spoke of what happened. Others were not so lucky. The images showed other families over the years. Some made it out alive but traumatized. Others simply vanished. Their cars found abandoned in the snow with no trace of the people inside. The cabin kept calling to new victims year after year, Christmas after Christmas. Now Sarah and David understood. They had been chosen because they fit the pattern. A family of 4, coming for Christmas, innocent and unprepared. The shadow creatures fed on fear and suffering. They had been toying with the Morgans since they arrived, building up terror slowly, enjoying every moment of it. The images faded from the wall, leaving only the carved warning that some previous victim had managed to scratch there before escaping or dying. The shadow creatures closed in tighter around. David and Sarah, the largest one, reached out its impossibly long arms toward them both. Then Sarah remembered something. The abandoned church in the forest, the protection symbols carved into the trees. Someone had tried to stop this evil before. Maybe those symbols held the answer. Maybe there was still a way to fight back and save her family. Sarah's mind worked frantically as the shadow creatures closed in around them. She remembered the symbols carved into the trees around the ruined church. Protection symbols. Someone had known about the evil in this cabin and had tried to contain it or destroy it. Those symbols were their only hope now. She grabbed David's hand and squeezed it hard, trying to communicate without words. David looked at her and saw determination in her eyes instead of fear. Sarah spoke loudly to the shadow creatures, her voice echoing in the cold basement. She told them that she understood their pain. They had been victims once too, trapped here by evil magic they didn't ask for. The creatures paused in their advance. The jingling of their bells quieted slightly, as if they were listening. Sarah continued speaking, her words coming faster now. She said they didn't have to keep serving the darkness. They could break free. The old woman who had cursed them was gone. Her power over them could be broken if they chose to fight it. The largest shadow creature, the one that had once been the old woman, let out a sound like wind howling through empty caves. It was angry. The other shadows began moving again, reaching toward David and Sarah with their elongated fingers. They had only seconds left. David suddenly understood what Sarah was trying to do. She was buying time, creating a distraction. He looked around the basement desperately for anything they could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on the old tools hanging on the walls. Rusty saws, hammers, axes. None of them would work against creatures made of shadow. But then he saw it. In the corner of the basement, almost hidden behind stacked boxes, was a can of gasoline. It must have been left by previous owners. Next to it was a box of old road flares, the kind people kept in their cars for emergencies. An idea formed in David's mind. It was dangerous and might not work, but it was their only chance. He broke away from Sarah and lunged toward the corner. The shadow creatures reacted immediately, several of them moving to block his path. But David was fast, driven by the desperate need to protect his family. He grabbed the gasoline can and the box of flares, rolling away from grasping shadow hands. Sarah understood instantly what David was planning. Fire. These creatures were made of darkness and shadow. Fire created light. It might be the one thing that could hurt them, or at least drive them back long enough for the family to escape. David twisted open the gasoline cap and started splashing the fuel around the basement floor. The shadow creatures shrieked with voices that sounded like breaking glass. They knew what was coming. Then the largest creature lunged toward David, but Sarah threw herself in its path, buying her husband precious seconds. David pulled out a road flare and struck it against the rough concrete floor. The road flare burst to life with brilliant red flames that filled the basement with blazing light. The shadow creatures screamed in agony, their forms flickering and twisting as the light touched them. David threw the burning flare into the puddle of gasoline on the floor. Flames erupted instantly, spreading across the concrete in a wave of fire.
Ow.
The shadows retreated violently, pressing themselves against the walls and ceiling to escape the light. Their bells jangled wildly in panic and pain. The largest creature, the twisted soul of the old woman, reached desperately toward David and Sarah one last time before the flames drove it back into the darkest corner of the basement.
Ow.
David grabbed Sarah's hand and they ran for the stairs. Behind them, the fire was growing, feeding on the old wooden support beams and boxes stored in the basement. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. They stumbled up the stairs and burst into the main room of the cabin. The shadow creatures throughout the house were fading now, becoming transparent and less solid. The fire in the basement was destroying whatever dark magic had kept them trapped in this world. Some of them reached out toward David and Sarah as they ran past, but their touch was weak and cold, no longer threatening. David and Sarah raced up the stairs to the second floor, shouting for their children. They found Emma and Tommy huddled together in the bathroom, just as David had told them. The children's faces were streaked with tears, but they were alive and unharmed. Sarah grabbed them both in a fierce hug, while David checked to make sure the way to the front door was clear. The cabin was filling with smoke now. They had to get out immediately. The family ran down the stairs together, coughing and choking. The Christmas decorations Sarah had hung just days ago were burning. The furniture was catching fire. The entire cabin was becoming an inferno. They burst through the front door into the freezing night air. Snow was still falling heavily, but they barely noticed the cold. David led them to the SUV and frantically searched his pockets for the keys. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip them. Finally, he unlocked the doors and everyone piled inside. The engine started on the first try and David threw the car into reverse. Tires spun on the icy ground for a terrifying moment before finding traction. They backed away from the burning cabin, then David turned the wheel and pointed the car toward the dirt road that led back to civilization. As they drove away, Sarah looked back through the rear window. The cabin was completely engulfed in flames now, lighting up the dark forest like a beacon. Standing at the edge of the trees, watching them leave, were the shadow creatures. But they looked different now, smaller, more human. As Sarah watched, they began to fade away completely, finally released from their decades of torment. The last thing she saw before they disappeared was the largest shadow raising one hand, almost like a wave goodbye. Then it was gone, and there was only fire and falling snow. The Morgan family drove through the night, navigating the treacherous mountain roads by memory and desperate hope. None of them spoke. They were too traumatized, too exhausted to process what had happened. Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, emotionally drained. Emma stared out the window with blank eyes, still trying to convince herself it had all been real. As dawn broke over the mountains, they finally reached the main highway. David's phone suddenly buzzed to life with a signal. Messages and notifications flooded in, but he ignored them all. Just kept driving, putting as much distance between his family and that cursed place as possible. They arrived home on Christmas Eve morning, 12 hours after fleeing the cabin. Their house looked exactly the same as when they had left it, but everything felt different now. They were different. They had seen true evil and somehow survived. Sarah called the local fire department in the mountain region to report the cabin fire, making up a story about a faulty gas heater. Investigators would find only ashes and charred wood. No bodies, no evidence of what had really happened there. The cabin would be listed as a total loss, and eventually, the land would be sold to someone else who knew nothing of its dark history. The Morgan family spent Christmas Day together in their own home, grateful to be alive and safe. They didn't put up decorations, they didn't exchange gifts. They simply held each other close and tried to begin healing from the nightmare they had endured. In the weeks and months that followed, they rarely spoke about what happened at the cabin. It was too painful, too terrifying to discuss openly. But sometimes, late at night, one of them would wake up hearing the faint sound of bells jingling in the darkness. And they would lie awake until morning, remembering the Christmas that almost destroyed them. David destroyed the photograph he had taken of the carved warning in the basement. Sarah threw away everything they had brought to the cabin, unable to look at any reminders. Emma started seeing a therapist but could never bring herself to tell the full truth about what she had witnessed. Tommy had nightmares for years, always the same dream of shadow figures with bells surrounding his bed. The Morgan family survived their encounter with the supernatural, but they were forever changed. They had learned that some places hold darkness that cannot be explained or understood. Some evils are older and stronger than human comprehension, and sometimes the best Christmas gift is simply making it home alive. Years later, Sarah would sometimes search online for information about that cabin, wondering if it had been rebuilt or if anyone else had experienced what they had. She found nothing. It was as if the place had been erased from existence, remembered only by those who had suffered there. But she knew the truth. Evil like that never truly dies, just waits in the darkness, patient and hungry for the next victims to arrive. She only hoped that by burning the cabin they had destroyed the doorway that allowed those shadow creatures to exist. She hoped that the tortured souls they had seen were finally at peace, released from their eternal prison. The Morgan family never took another vacation together and never spent Christmas away from home again. And whenever December came around, bringing its festive cheer and holiday magic, they would remember that not all Christmas stories have happy endings. Some Christmas tales are nightmares that haunt you forever, reminding you that darkness exists even in the most joyful season. This was their story. This was the true Christmas horror that changed everything. The nightmare that they survived but could never forget. The holiday that taught them that some gifts come wrapped in terror, and some homes hold secrets that should never be discovered. They were the lucky ones. They escaped. But they would carry the scars of that experience for the rest of their lives. Always looking over their shoulders, always listening for the sound of bells jingling in the night. The end.